I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Matthew Andrews. I'm a professor in the Department of History here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do in my classes and what my area of expertise is in just a second. But I'm going to start right away with a story to get us immersed in this topic about the Olympic Games. We're going to visit many past Olympic Games in the next hour. But let's start by going back to the 1956 Melbourne Games. These were the first Olympic Games in the Southern Hemisphere. So they took place in the Southern Hemisphere summer. So it was in late November and early December, right? The Australian summer. And so they took place at the end of a turmoil-filled year. 1956, as you may know, was a year of tremendous crises. There was the escalating Cold War. There was the Suez Crisis in the Middle East. And there was the Hungarian Revolution. The Hungarian Revolution takes place in late 1956 when Hungarian reformers, they were calling for new political freedoms. They wanted to be able to speak openly and debate political ideas. They wanted an end to Soviet domination of their political system. And so it was a moment of optimism and excitement and turmoil. And then the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, he sent in the tanks and he crushed this optimism. Soviet troops, they stormed through Budapest. Over 2,500 Hungarians were killed in November of 1956. And coincidentally, this crackdown was occurring right as the nations of the world, they were gathering in Melbourne, Australia for the Summer Olympic Games. And as fate would have it, as all this was happening, the water polo teams from these two nations, Hungary and the Soviet Union, they met in the pool for the semifinals of the water polo competition. And here's what happened, and this is remarkable. Things this day, they were tense, but the Soviet and the Hungarian players, they embraced, they wished each other luck. They played a clean but spirited game. I actually don't remember who won. No one does. It doesn't actually matter. And responding to the sportsmanship showed in the swimming pool this day, the sportsmanship that these athletes had shown. Soviet and Hungarian leaders, they called for a truce on the streets of Budapest. And then the Soviet authorities, they pulled their troops out of Hungary. Sports had healed political wounds. Sports had made the world a better place. No, that's not what happened. You probably know that. I'm sorry to be the one to break this to you, but sports just do not seem to have that power. Here's what actually happened. The Soviets and the Hungarians, they did meet in the semifinals of the water polo tournament. The arena was filled with Hungarian refugees, Hungarian Australians, and they had their Hungarian flags, and they were jeering the Soviet players as the competition took place. The Hungarians, they got out to a 2-0 lead, and the Hungarian players and the fans, they were taunting the Soviets. They were calling them invaders. They were calling them murderers. And then all hell broke loose. In the final minute of the game, a Soviet player swung a vicious elbow at the Hungarian player, Ervin Zsador, and it just split open his cheek. The water turned red from all the blood. And some of the Hungarian supporters, in the stands, they ran down to the pool. They surrounded the pool, and they started threatening the Soviet players. The Australian police had to come in and sort of back everyone off, and the match was declared over early. Hungary was declared the winner. Here's one of the headlines from one of the Melbourne newspapers the next day. Fists flew and blood flowed. And immediately after the match, one of the Hungarian players, he bitterly said of the Soviets, they play their sports just as they conduct their lives, with brutality and disregard for fair play. Here's my point by starting with this story. Sports are not lessening international tensions here in 1956. They are a reflection of those tensions. If anything, they are exacerbating these tensions. And there was an awfully astute writer in London in the middle of the 20th century. His name is George Orwell. Perhaps you've heard of him. And he once attended an international sporting competition, and he was horrified by the win at all costs mentality that he saw, by the nationalist passions that international sports seemed to unleash. And he returned home. He sat down at his typewriter, and here's what he wrote. Serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It is bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting. What I want to do today is use this quote from Orwell about war minus the shooting. And I want to use it as a launching point for kind of a fast-paced exploration of the modern Olympic Games. The Tokyo Olympics may or may not be happening this summer. The Tokyo Olympics president, Yoshiro Mori, is actually in the news today. He's being forced to resign his position as president of the Tokyo Olympic Committee because of some very sexist things that he said a couple of weeks ago. And it's actually sparked a larger conversation in Japan about sexism in that nation's culture. And that's actually indicative of what I want to talk about today. That's what the Olympics do. The Olympics are not just about sports. The Olympics are about everything. They provide us an opportunity to talk about everything. You know, there was a journalist named William Oscar Johnson who once wrote this about the Olympic Games. To write properly about the Olympic Games of the 20th century is to write about almost everything in the 20th century, about plastics and politics and racism and the demise of the rigid Bible morality and the rise of situation ethics, about avarice and airplanes and vitamin pills and chauvinism and free love and selling refrigerators on television and urban renewal and electricity. So I teach a course here at UNC Chapel Hill. I teach a number of courses that use sports to explore American culture and global politics. And the relevant course that I teach here is titled The Olympic Games, a Global History. And I absolutely love teaching this course. It's my favorite course to teach. And the students seem to love it as well. Actually, the student newspaper has more than once named it the best course at UNC. And I like to think that I have something to do with that, and I'll pat myself on the back. But I also know that the students love this course because they get to learn about everything, or at least they learn a little bit about many things. So that's what I want to do today. I want to use the Olympic Games to explore many of the significant storylines out there in 20th and 21st century global culture. You know, the Olympics, you may not realize this, but let's think about what the Olympics are. The Olympics are the largest regularly scheduled international event in the world. Not sporting event. They are the largest regularly scheduled international event in the world. And as such, the Olympic Games are a major political showcase. How did that happen? You know, how did they become this? Well, I'm going to tell you that story first. The story begins with this man. The modern Olympic Games were created in 1894 through the efforts of a minor member of the French nobility, a man named Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And Coubertin created the modern Olympic Games in 1894, though it's really more precise to say that he revived the ancient Olympic Games. What we now call the ancient Olympic Games, they began in 776 BC. They ran to 393 AD, or BCE and CE. They occurred every 4 years without exception, a mind-boggling run of 1,200 years. But then they went away. They were destroyed by the Christian Roman emperors who were troubled by the game's pagan attributes, not to mention the fact that the athletes at the ancient Olympic Games, they completed totally naked with their bodies slathered in olive oil. That's a different story for a different lecture. Let's stay in the 1890s. The modern Olympic movement then, it was created in 1894 through the energies of Pierre de Coubertin. That's him there, second from the right, standing up. And Coubertin was a French physical educator who became obsessed with the idea of using sports to promote international cooperation throughout the world. although when he said the world, he was mainly thinking Europe. He wanted to use sports to bring nations together. He wanted to use sports to heal the past wounds from past wars. So in 1894, Coubertin invited dozens of men to attend a Congress at the Sorbonne in Paris. It's called a Congress on the Revival of the Olympic Games. This is when and where the modern Olympic movement is going to be born. And Coubertin, he was in charge. He gave a lengthy speech. He told the men there of his plan to create a great international athletic festival, one that would happen every 4 years, just like the ancient Olympic Games, and one that would revolve among the great international capitals of the world. And the idea behind this was this: men, and it was all men at first, men who play sports with each other, no matter their differences. Coubertin believed that they would develop a healthy understanding and camaraderie and respect for each other. This is the idea of Olympism, the idea of international understanding through sports. It's the central idea of the Olympic Games. It's what Coubertin called Olympism. Competition in sports, it breeds mutual respect and understanding. It will prevent future wars. Olympism. So why not, right? It's worth a shot. Let's try this. I mean, the late 19th century was filled with European wars. Coubertin is trying to stop this. But then at that very same Congress, Coubertin and the other members of the organization that he created, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, they made an interesting decision. And it was a decision that led to a tension, I think, at the Olympic Games, to a paradox, we might say, at the Olympic Games. Coubertin and the organization that he created, they decided that individuals could not compete in the Olympics as individuals. They had to compete as representatives of nations. They had to represent and wear a flag. And so let's think about this. Coubertin created the games to ease global tensions. But by ruling that athletes had to participate as representatives of nations, one could argue that what the games do, they don't bring international harmony. What they do is they feed off existing international tensions. They may even exacerbate those tensions. I think I gave you a pretty good example of that at the start of this lecture. Think about what we do when we watch the Olympic Games. I know we all interact with sports differently, but I know many people root for their nation and thus against other nations. And that's not what Olympism is supposed to be. So think for a minute how different the Olympics would be if athletes competed as individuals rather than as people tethered to national identities. What if the Olympics ignored the idea of nationalism rather than reinforced the idea of nationalism, which, after all, is the idea that everyone from one nation is the same and they're different from everyone else around the world. In my Olympics history course here at UNC Chapel Hill, it drives my students nuts. I like to play a game with my students. I say, I submit for the sake of argument that the Olympics would be better. They would be more pure and more in line with Coubertin's original intent if the games countered the idea of nationalism. They would be better if athletes competed as individuals rather than as representatives of nations. And I ask them to think about it. I say, what if instead of the Olympic Parade of Nations, where athletes march out in their national colors and waving a flag as representatives of nations, what if instead of this, there was the Parade of Athletes, where the athletes of the world, they came out one by one, but divided up by sport. Here come the shot putters together. Here come the swimmers together. Here come the gymnasts together. Yeah. I think that would be pretty cool. All these different body types sort of lumped together by sport. But more to my point, this would be a statement of athletic togetherness. Regardless of where one is born, we're all the same. Now, whenever I make this suggestion to my students, they look at me as if I am crazy. They like the national identities. It gives them immediate rooting interest. But that's the point. When you root for someone just because they're from your nation, you are rooting against someone just because they are not from your nation. And look, there is no doubt in my mind that this insistence on nationalism at the games, that it increases interest in the Olympic Games. But hey, wars are interesting too, right? All right, cheap shot, but I'm sure you get my point by now. Sports are interesting on their own. The Olympic Games, the athletic competitions, I think are interesting on their own, but it's the pull and the power of nationalism that makes them really interesting. The Olympic Games work as well as they do. They are as big as they are because, and let's think about this, they indulge precisely what they say they are trying to transcend, our basest instinct for tribalism. Let's explore how this tribalism played out at the games. And I'm going to keep this sort of globally local. I'm going to focus on the United States. I guess I'm falling into this nationalist trap. But I'm going to focus on the meaning of the Olympic Games for Americans over the course of the 20th century. Americans have used the Olympic Games from the very start to make claims about international power and international supremacy. For example, in the early 20th century, America's greatest Olympic rival was Great Britain. In the early 20th century, there was this athletic rivalry between the globe's long-standing power, Britain, and the globe's up-and-coming power, the United States. There's a political cartoon before the 1908 Olympic Games that kind of speaks to how Americans were thinking about this rivalry. This rivalry was crystallized at the Olympic Games in 1908. They were in London, they were in Britain. And it was crystallized during the Parade of Nations. As each country's delegation of athletes, as they marched around the stadium and they passed the royal box where the British King, Edward VII, I think, where he was, that nation's flag holder dipped their flag as a show of respect to their royal host. But Ralph Rose, right there, the American shot putter holding the American flag, he did not dip the American flag out of respect. He held it high. Some say he actually raised it a little bit higher. As the story goes, he was asked about this and he said, "This flag dips to no earthly king," although he almost certainly didn't actually say that. That was a line that was invented a couple of decades later. It's a great line, but he never said it. But the British, they were insulted, and there was actual talk of breaking off diplomatic relations between the United States and Great Britain because of what Ralph Rose had done at the Olympic Games. And that's not how Olympism is supposed to work, people, right? Olympism is supposed to bring members of nations together, not tear them apart. And interestingly, what Rose did actually started a tradition in the United States. The United States never dips its flag at the Olympic Games in deference to the host. Almost all other nations do this. The United States, their athletes, they never do this. Something that Americans take pride in, but something I got to tell you that the rest of the world, they see this as evidence of American hubris and very bad manners on the part of the United States. 2 decades later, it was the Americans against the Nazis in Berlin, 1936. We want to talk about how the Olympic Games can be used for sort of, evil nationalistic purposes. That's exactly what Adolf Hitler was trying to do. He was trying to use these games to demonstrate Nazi Aryan supremacy vis-a-vis the rest of the world. In the United States, Americans, they were gleeful when Jesse Owens, he won 4 gold medals. Those are the events right there. He contradicted those assertions coming from Adolf Hitler. In the US, we like to say that Jesse Owens spoiled Adolf Hitler's Olympics. But I do want to point out, and here's the number of medals won by each nation at that games. The German athletes easily won the most medals in 1936. Back in Berlin, they said they got exactly what they wanted out of these games, that this medal count, this proved German dominance. The 1936 Olympics, they were the last Olympics for a while. There would be no Olympics in 1940, World War II. There would be no Olympics in 1944, World War II once again. And then when the Olympics got going again after the Second World War, the Americans had a new international and Olympic rival, the Soviet Union. And I want to spend a little time talking about the rivalry between the United States and the USSR, this sort of Cold War battle between 2 post-war superpowers, again, the US and the Soviets. The president of the IOC after World War II was an American named Avery Brundage. And he once said this about politics in the Olympic Games. He said, "Some misguided persons seem to think that Olympic sport can be made a political tool. This is as erroneous as anything can be. The minute politics are permitted in the Olympics, the games are finished." Actually, that's not true at all. In reality, the absolute opposite was true. I mean, once Cold War politics and tensions made their way into the Olympic Games were more popular than ever. The whole world was paying attention to the Olympic Games because they were an expression of the Cold War. The Soviets, they had never been at the Olympic Games. And then after the war, their leader, Joseph Stalin, he decided that he wanted to do what the Americans had been doing. He wanted to use the Olympics as an expression of national domination. Right after the war, the Soviet government, they created something called the National Scientific Research Institute for Sports Culture. This institute, it was an organized attempt to run sports training sites all around the Soviet Union, where they looked for young athletic talent. And then when they located that talent, they would mold those young athletes into future Olympians. The idea being you will win medals for the Soviet Union in future Olympic Games. Here's one of these gymnastics institutes where young Soviet girls, they are being tried out and seeing who has athletic talent. Now, for Americans, scenes like this, the Soviet sports system, it was a perfect example of everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union. You know, here was a system in which individuals had no free choice. They were told what to do and where to go by their government. But for Soviet officials, this is what socialism could do. You know, everyone pitching in, doing their part, everyone's talent being identified and recognized by the state, and then the state supporting that talent as people develop their particular skills. Maybe you're a ballet dancer, maybe you're a physicist, maybe you're a teacher, or maybe you're a gymnast. So here is the key idea at the Cold War Olympics. And I think we just sort of want to say, oh, these events, they're symbolic, but they're deeply symbolic. On the one hand, we might argue that victory in international sport is meaningless. Like, fine, that American can put the shot further, and that Soviet javelin thrower, he can throw the javelin further. So what? But if you dig deeper, the question that is being answered at these Cold War Olympic Games is this: which of these two nations has the best system in which to develop strong human beings? Which of these two nations has the best system in which to maximize human potential? Is it the United States with a system based on individualism and competition, capitalism? Or is it the Soviets with their system, their socialist system, where centralized planning is emphasized, in which everything is directed by the state, and in which athletes are said to represent the selfless collective ethos of socialism? The Americans like to say their system was better. The Soviets like to say their system was better, and they were going to prove it at the Olympic Games. The first Olympic Games where the Soviets appeared, it was the 1952 Olympic Games. These were in Helsinki, Finland. It was at the opening ceremony in Helsinki where American and Soviet athletes, they eyed each other for the first time. This opening ceremony, it was fascinating. There was the Parade of Nations. There was the reading of the Olympic Oath. There was the official welcome from Finnish politicians. Then came a speech from a German college student, Barbara Rotrat-Plyer, and this was a very interesting moment. She walked to the podium and she spoke about global peace. She talked about the horrors of atomic war. She called on the United States and the Soviet Union to immediately destroy their rapidly growing atomic arsenals. And then in this flowing white dress, she started to run a lap around the track. It took a moment for the organizers to realize this person was not supposed to be there. She was an activist who just snuck her way into the stadium, walked up to the podium, and started giving this speech. You try this at the Olympic Games now and you get vaporized from a drone. Here, she was just quickly surrounded and ushered away. The newspapers the next day called her deranged, though I'm not sure what's so deranged about calling for global peace. And then the competitions. And the Cold War battle for Olympic medals happens here. And it's in the context of the Cold War that the idea of a medal count really gets going in the Olympic Games. Look, if this is a battle for international domination, we have to have a way of calculating who wins this competition. The IOC always wagged their finger and said, no counting of medals allowed. Which is ridiculous because everybody was doing it. And the way many media sources did it, and the way I do it in my classes is this. We award 3 medals to a nation when one of their athletes gets a gold medal, three points, 2 points for a silver, and 1 point for a bronze, a 3-2-1 counting system. I think that's reasonable. Using this system, the Soviets got out to an early lead in the medal count on the strength of their female athletes. And incredibly, some American Olympic officials said, no, female victories shouldn't count. Female sports shouldn't count in the medal count. This is a sign of how primitive ideas were in the United States about female athleticism. They were way more developed in the Soviet Union than they were in the United States. Well, based on their domination of the track and field events, the United States surged back and won the medal count, 174 points to 145. So this was an American victory, but this was not as big a victory as many in the United States expected. The Americans were longtime Olympic competitors. The Soviets, they were rookies. This shocked Americans. And what shocked them even more was what happened in 1956. The Soviets easily won the medal count. Soviet athletes won more golds, more silvers, and more bronze medals than American athletes, 201 to 63. They did it again 4 years later in Rome, 1960. It was a wipeout. Soviet athletes easily won the medal count. Larisa Latynina, Michael Phelps has won the most medals in Olympic history, the American swimmer. Larisa Latynina, the great Soviet gymnast, she has won the second most medals in the history of the Olympic Games. These Olympic losses, and that's how Americans thought of it, they were losses. They sparked a lot of soul searching in the United States. And they had a direct effect on policy in the United States. Did you do the presidential fitness test as a kid growing up? Or maybe your kids did the presidential fitness test? This is where it comes from. This was a test that was created in the 1950s as a way to mold American school children into more fit athletes, better athletes who could help win the medal count against the Soviets at the Olympic Games. I vividly remember I had my certificate from Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, attesting to the fact that I could live up to a certain standard in 5 different events. Though I'm going to do something right now. I'm going to come clean right here and right now with the microphone in front of me and the recorder going. I want to admit that I cheated on the presidential fitness test. I didn't think it was fair that you had to do pull-ups as pull-ups with your knuckles facing you. I could do chin-ups, sort of reverse pull-ups, but I could never do pull-ups. So when my teacher asked me what my number was, I lied. I know, terrible, but in my defense, this was the 1970s. I did all this in the shadow of Watergate. I think this is all justifiable. But my point right now is not that I, Matt Andrews, lied to my government. My point is that these tests were a direct response to the Cold War. In the name of winning the Cold War Olympics and demonstrating to the rest of the world that Americans are better than Soviets, Johnny and Sally must be more fit than Sergei and Svetlana. The next Olympic Games were in Tokyo, Japan. The Americans and the Soviets basically tied in the medal count. But here's where I want to move away from the question of the Cold War, and I want to explore another phenomenon that we see at the Olympic Games. I want to talk about how nations use the Olympic Games to tell stories about themselves. And this is a great example right here. In 1964, the Japanese government, they used the Olympic Games to tell the rest of the world that they were back. They were back on their feet after the horrors of World War II. The 64 Tokyo Olympics were an announcement of Japan's rebirth, their renaissance after the war. It was an expression of their desire to re-enter the international community. And here's an interesting fact that illuminates that idea. The Japanese torchbearer, the citizen who was given the honor of lighting the Olympic cauldron, was a young man named Yoshinori Sakai. And Sakai was chosen for this honor because he was born in Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. He was in that city on the day that an American warplane dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The United States Olympic Committee, they strenuously objected to this choice, this reminder to the world that the United States had dropped bombs on babies. But this was a story about themselves that the Japanese wanted to tell. All Olympic Games do this in some way. Mexico City, 1968, this was the Mexican government's announcement that Mexico City was a thriving modern metropolis. It wasn't all ruins and huts on the beach in Mexico. Mexico was modern. 4 years later, in Munich, the West Germans, they wanted to use these games to erase the memory of the Berlin Olympics, the Nazi Olympics of 1936. They wanted to present an image of a restrained, democratic, and transformed West German nation. You know, these games were to be an atonement for the sins of Berlin in 1936. They were to be the anti-Berlin Olympics. We could see this in the opening ceremonies. You know, Berlin was all orchestrated Sieg Heils in deference to Adolf Hitler. But in Munich in 1972, it was Bavarian men and women folk dancing in their lederhosen, a very different vibe. The ABC announcer, Jim McKay, the American sports announcer, he had a good line about these opening ceremonies. He said, "It's Hansel and Gretel, not Hitler and Goering." And then you probably know what happens next. Then came the madness when members of a Palestinian organization called Black September, they invaded the Olympic Village. They took 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage. They did this as they saw it because of the unjust Israeli occupation of Palestine. And they eventually killed all 11 of those Israeli athletes. You know, avoiding the specifics of their political cause, they selected the Olympics for two reasons. First, the whole world was there. And look, the global media was there. And I know this is crass, but what better place to have your political grievances heard than at the Olympic Games where the whole world is literally watching. The other reason that they did this, and very few people actually know this, the plot was hatched 1 month earlier at a cafe in Rome. Members of Black September, they read a newspaper report that the Palestinian bid, the Palestinian authorities, they wanted to compete at the Olympic Games as Palestine. But the IOC said, no, you're not a real nation, and only real nations get to come to the Olympic Games. You know, political entities, they want recognition in two places. They want a seat at the United Nations, and they want to march in the Parade of Nations at the Olympic Games. You know, Israel was at the United Nations. Israel got to march in the Parade of Nations, and Palestinians said, we want to be recognized at these places too. But the IOC said no. And this decision was the spark. As the members of Black September saw it, the IOC was telling them that they didn't count, that they were nobodies. And so they attacked. I would say that this too was war minus the shooting, but it was the exact opposite. There was shooting. It was a bloody disaster and the absolute low point of the modern Olympic movement. And it is blowback, I would argue, from Coubertin's decision that all athletes have to come as representatives of nations. There were those who thought that after 1972, that the Olympics were on their way out. You can see this 1972 magazine cover, Can the Olympics Be Fixed by 1976? There were those who said after the next games, the Montreal 1976 games, as we can see here, the Olympics are in trouble. The reason why the Montreal Games were a disaster, some said, was because of money. It was the Montreal Olympics in 1976 that first demonstrated what an economic fiasco the Olympic Games could be. This is a theme I want to explore for a couple minutes here. The Montreal Organizing Committee swore up and down. They promised Canadians that the revenues coming in would exceed costs. We're not going to lose money at these games. We're going to make money. The whole world is coming. We're going to make money. The mayor of Montreal, a guy named Jean Drapeau, he was also the head of the Montreal Organizing Committee. He boasted, the Montreal Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. Okay. Well, when they bid for these games, the Montreal organizers, they told the people of Canada and of Montreal that these games are going to cost $125 million. That's US dollars. They ended up costing $1.5 billion. Today, $6.5 billion. The most ever at that point. Now, actually, 1.5 sounds quaint. I'm getting to that. In Montreal, the reason for the high costs was that almost every penny of this 1.5 billion, it went to building brand new stadiums for the Olympic Games. And the joke in Montreal was that Jean Drapeau had an edifice complex, right? He was obsessed with shiny new stadiums. The organizers like to call the main stadium where the games took place, Le Stade Olympique, they like to call it the Big O, O for Olympics. Critics started calling it the Big O because the people of Montreal were going to owe a lot of money. Expenses were $1.5 billion. Revenues were only a third of that. They lost $1 billion on these games. These games gutted the Montreal economy. For the next 30 years, the people of Montreal, they were paying off this debt at the expense of building new roads, schools, highways, hospitals. So to go back to this quote, the Montreal Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. I guess it wasn't true. Or was it? Because in 2008, just a couple years after the people of Montreal finally paid off the debt from these Olympic Games, a man had a baby. Thomas Beatty from Bend, Oregon had been born female, but transitioned to male in his 20s, but he kept his female reproductive organs. In 2008, he got pregnant and he gave birth to a daughter. Aha, I do not think that Jean Drapeau had considered this possibility when he made that financial guarantee. There are so many Olympic Games that are financial disasters. They almost all are now. The most staggering example of an Olympic-sized spending spree comes from 2014, the Winter Olympic Games that were in Sochi, Russia. You know, if you were charged with the task of convincing people that hosting the Olympic Games is a bad idea, these are probably the games you would talk about. These were Vladimir Putin's games, you know, and Putin inherited the old Soviet belief that prowess in international sports is a way to demonstrate national domination. You know, Putin clearly believes that hosting big-time sporting events like the Olympics in 2014, like the World Cup in 2018, he clearly believes that hosting these events are symbols of national virility. And I would argue symbols of his own masculinity, which he likes to put on display every chance he gets. How much did these 2014 games cost? Well, it's hard to get a precise number, but the number that the economists seem to have settled on is, and brace yourself for this, $51 billion for these games. If it is $51 billion, they are the most expensive games ever, winter or summer. And half the nation or half the world doesn't even pay attention to the Winter Olympics. And if it's $51 billion, this makes these Winter Olympic Games more expensive than all the other Winter Olympic Games combined from 1924 to 2010. These were more expensive than all of them added up. You know, I was looking at what people were saying about Sochi, $51 billion, as I was preparing for this lecture. You know, what kind of revenue has started coming in after the games? And so I was looking at numbers for 2019. You know, COVID kind of threw everything off. And I ran across an article that suggested actually Sochi might be a financial success. They said winter tourism, because of these games, it's actually picking up. They said in 2019, Sochi brought in $55 million in tourism profits. And I thought 55 million, all right, that sounds like a lot, so I pulled out my calculator, which is really my phone, and I entered in $55 million and I divided that into 51 billion. At that rate, it's going to take Sochi 927 years in order to pay off these games, to make them pay for themselves. Anyway, the way the whole thing is structured in Russia, the Russian taxpayers are paying $1 billion a year for the lengthy foreseeable future. And all of this is coming at the expense of building roads, schools, hospitals, because of COVID, did I say hospitals? The high cost of Sochi was the result of building a winter sports wonderland in a place that didn't have anything at the start. They had to build everything from scratch in Sochi: roads, hotels, sports venues, the whole thing. The fiercest critic of the Sochi Games was the Russian politician and reformer Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov said, look, we need to spend money on lots of things in Russia, but a modern winter sports resort is not one of them. On top of that, he said, you have with Sochi what we call in Russia the Russian surcharge. This refers to bribes, kickbacks. Nemtsov thinks that 30 billion of that 51 billion actually went directly into the pockets of Putin and his cronies who were leading the construction charge, didn't even go into constructing the Olympic Games. Nemtsov called the 2014 Sochi Games a swindler's paradise. You know what happened next? The year after the Games, 2015, Nemtsov was murdered. He was shot 4 times in the back as he crossed a bridge in Moscow. So what do we make of the Olympic Games? What comes next? The problem with the Olympic Games are massive. They are gargantuan. And I haven't even talked about boycotts, like when the Americans boycotted Moscow in 1980 and the Soviets returned the favor when they boycotted Los Angeles in 1984. The Games were not easing Cold War tensions in the 80s. They were exacerbating them with these boycotts. With all of the politics, with all of the potential for violence and the skyrocketing security costs, with the billions of dollars it takes to run the Olympic Games, the bids are actually starting to dry up. Nations are starting to get smart and think, do we really want to host the Olympic Games? This is why in 2017, in an unprecedented move, the IOC decided to reward 2 future Olympic Games at the same time. Paris got them for 2024. Los Angeles got them for 2028. And the IOC did this because they needed stability. These were the only 2 cities bidding for the 2024 Games. And so they thought, let's lock them both up right now. Let's have them sign contracts. We want to make sure that we have games in both of these years. It could happen soon. The IOC could say, who wants the Olympic Games? And the response could be crickets, especially after what's going to happen in the next calendar year. The 2020 Games, the Tokyo Games, have been pushed back 1 year. They're now taking place, or so they say, in this summer, 2021, although the IOC wants us to still call it the 2020 Games, branding and all that. The 2022 Winter Games are scheduled for Beijing, China. They're scheduled actually to start just a few months after the Summer Games in February of 2022. The Japanese government is desperate to get something out of their investment in these games. When they bid for the games, they told the people of Japan, our budget is about $13 billion. The economists who are looking at this the most closely, they say the costs already went up to about 26 billion, so they doubled. Now, because of the 1 year delay, you got to tack on another 6 billion, they said. So let's say $30 billion. And now they may not get to host the games at all. And polls suggest that 80% of Japanese people don't want the games. They don't want people from all over the world cramming into Tokyo for a 2-week sports festival during a global pandemic. So they may spend 30 billion on these games and not get anything out of it. I mean, that would make Montreal look like just losing change between the couch cushions. I mean, what a disaster this would be for Tokyo. And let's assume for the sake of argument that maybe these games and the Beijing 2022 games do happen. If they do, Get ready for some politics. Get ready for some political protest. You know, Beijing had the Summer Games in 2008, and human rights protesters were everywhere protesting the IOC's choice. And the political theater of choice in 2008 was as the Olympic torch was sort of winding its way around the world to Beijing, protesters tried to extinguish the Olympic torch, extinguish the torch of liberty as they saw it. The whole thing, if you were a torchbearer, you ended up being surrounded by these badass regimen of Chinese security forces. I mean, good luck getting anywhere near the Olympic torch in 2008. It's going to happen again. Currently, there are more than 180 human rights organizations. They're calling for a boycott of the 2022 Games. They want to boycott because of Chinese human rights abuses, they say, in Tibet, Taiwan, with the Uyghur community, Hong Kong. Here in the United States, I guarantee you, politicians are going to try to make a big issue out of this. And I'm not actually saying that they shouldn't. It's interesting. 2 years ago, the U.S. Senators, Rick Scott of Florida and Josh Hawley of Missouri, hey, that guy's been in the news recently, they were already calling on NBC not to broadcast the 2022 Beijing Winter Games. So they are openly accusing NBC of privileging corporate profits over human dignity. That's their argument. You think Josh Hawley is going to pass on this opportunity to make the American media look like heartless hypocrites? Oh, he's going to be talking about this non-stop. If either of these games happen, what I will be looking for, what I'm always looking for at the Olympic Games, are the protests, the athlete protests. The Olympics have long been a venue for political display by athletes. The most famous example is 1968. Americans are very familiar with Tommie Smith and John Carlos making a statement of black pride, of black power on the medal stand. Most Americans don't know this, though. The first medal stand protest at these games came from the Czech gymnast Vera Chaslovska. She came to these games seething by the Soviet domination of her country. The Soviets had put down a rebellion in Czechoslovakia in the summer of 1968. So as she stood on the medal stand right here with a Soviet gymnast, and as the Soviet national anthem played, she turned her head away from the Soviet flag. She refused to look at the flag of her oppressors as she saw it. She returned home to Czechoslovakia, and her athletics career was over. In recent years, there has been a sudden resurgence in athlete activism. I think it was sparked by Colin Kaepernick to a large degree in 2016. And in light of these protests, the IOC is very scared that the upcoming games are just going to be one protest after another. What the IOC does not want to see is something like this, when the American athlete Rayson Bowden took a knee in protest of police brutality in the United States. He did this at the 2019 Pan Am Games. What the IOC does not want to see is something like this, when the American hammer thrower, Gwen Berry, she raised the fist as a statement of black pride, as a protest against racial violence, also at the Pan Am Games of 2019. What the IOC does not want to see is something like this, when the Hong Kong athlete, Lee Cheuk-Yiu, he was competing at the 2019 badminton competition, the Hong Kong Open, and he gave the 5 demands, not one less gesture. This is a statement from anti-China, pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. You better believe that the Chinese government does not want to see any of this in Tokyo, or certainly not in Beijing. And you better believe it would be awfully brave to make a gesture like that if you were in Beijing in 2022. All that said, with all the politics and the economic misery and the human rights issues that I've been just sort of laying out the last hour, I am sadly, and I kind of mean that, sadly still a sucker for the Olympic Games. There is an optimism that's been at the root of these games since these guys came together at the Sorbonne in 1894. They said that these games would make the world a better place. You know, this is the idea of Olympism. Maybe the Olympics did make the world a better place. Maybe the Olympic Games made the world a worse place. Maybe they had no effect on the world at all. But there's a part of me that just thinks, wouldn't it be great if we as a global society, after all we've been through the last year, if we were able to come out of this moment, and we'd have to come out of the moment, right? We would have to get more healthy as a global society. Wouldn't it be great if we could come out of this moment this summer and we could gather together in Tokyo, healthy, fit, strong bodies coming together at the end of this pandemic for an athletic spectacle? And sheesh, they've already spent the $30 billion. So why not? He says, not sure if he actually believes it. So I want to say thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to looking at your questions and answering your questions. So thank you. And now let's get to some questions and answers. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for those of you who have submitted questions, and you can continue to do so. I'm going to start tackling some of these questions. Go to the glasses here, so I can read them. And I'm really struck by how so many people were asking about my idea here that the Olympics, that athletes should represent themselves as individuals and not as nations. And some of you actually seem interested and more than that, excited in this idea, which is not what my students are like. My students hate this idea. I mean, they unanimously hate this idea. So a couple of questions that go along this. The first question here is asking about whether did individuals compete in the ancient Olympics as individuals or representatives of countries. And, of course, the notion of nations back then actually didn't exist. But in ancient Greece, people represented cities, right? So they represented city-states. So people would know that this athlete was from Athens, this athlete was from Sparta. There was nothing on their uniform. There was no uniforms because they were naked when they competed. But people knew who they were and where they were from, and a victory would bring honor to their hometown. I'm not an expert on the ancient games, but I've read enough about them to be able to answer that. And then a lot of people are interested in the practical aspects of this idea. One question is, how would you handle qualifying? You could have a sport where all the best competitors in the world are from one country, and does that even matter? And again, this is just my theory. To be clear, the International Olympic Committee, they're not doing it. Having people identify with nations, right, as we talked about, nationalism really, really sells. It kind of drives the Olympic movement. But I would say that shouldn't matter. In fact, if there's one thing that my students are willing to listen to, it's this. I say, let's talk about gymnastics. For the past dozen years or so, I think you can make the argument that every Olympic Games, the 4 or 5 best overall gymnasts in the world, they're all from the United States. But because each nation is only allowed to put forward 3 for the overall competition, one could argue that the 4th and 5th best gymnasts every Olympic Games, they don't get to compete for the all-around. So my idea here about letting athletes compete as individuals and not as representatives of nations, that sort of barrier where each nation could only have 3 would not come into play. Yeah, it's true. Some sports are very national specific. The ping pong tournament would be dominated by China, for example. That was actually one of the reasons why Coubertin was not interested in Winter Olympics. Winter Olympics did not happen until 1924. Coubertin actually didn't like skiing. That was one of the reasons. But so many winter sports were considered country specific at that time. The Canadians were good at hockey. The Norwegians were good at cross-country skiing. It was the Scottish who were good at curling. And so the idea was one nation would just endlessly dominate those sports. So yeah, that would happen. That would definitely happen in this proposal. I'm willing to give it a shot though. And then another question was about, well, what about team sports? And that is the flaw in my logic. I do not know how to get around the idea of team sports. I sort of jokingly say, well, look, we're almost going this way anyway. why don't we just have, let's say like for basketball, why don't we just have corporations sponsor teams? We could have, instead of Team USA and Team France and Team Germany, we could have Team Nike and Team Adidas and Team Reebok, although I don't think Reebok exists anymore. Whatever, Team Enron, they don't exist either. I would not like to see that. I would not like to see that type of corporate identity find its way into the Olympic Games, although that's one possible solution, I guess. Someone else asked about the sort of famous Jesse Owens Adolf Hitler story. They asked, they had heard that Hitler had congratulated Jesse Owens. Actually, the way the story is often told, it's the opposite. It's that Adolf Hitler snubbed Jesse Owens. Adolf Hitler refused to congratulate Jesse Owens. That's actually sort of not true in the following way. Adolf Hitler, in the first day of the games, congratulated all of the German victors. He did not want to congratulate anyone who was not German. And so the IOC went to him and said, well, we'd like a little consistency here. Could you please congratulate all of the athletes or none of the athletes? I think clearly bothered by the idea that he might have to congratulate a black athlete. I mean, Hitler was very clear about this. The Nazi Party, very clear. They thought it was beneath the dignity of German athletes to compete against Jewish athletes and to compete against black athletes. He decided not to congratulate any of the athletes. So that notion that he snubbed Jesse Owens is not exactly true. But it is true that when Jesse Owens came back, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not have any interest in actually meeting Jesse Owens and celebrating his accomplishment, something that bothered Jesse Owens very much. And Jesse Owens, when he came back to the United States, he was not able to kind of cash in on his Olympic victory. And I think this has to do with race. You might know this about Jesse Owens, what he had to do when he came back. He didn't have to do it, but what he did in order to make in sports. Jesse Owens, the great American hero of the 1936 Olympics, he would travel around to fairs and carnivals, and he would race against horses, if you can imagine that. A really very demeaning athletic spectacle. Such were the lack of opportunities for great African-American athletes in the 1930s. Yeah, these questions are great here. Let's see. Someone is asking about the popularity of the men's and women's World Cup tournaments on the Olympics. And there's actually a really interesting story there. Well, first of all, we can see a gender difference right away. Men started playing soccer, or what the rest of the world calls football, at the Olympics in 1900. Women did not play football at the Olympic Games until 1996. So it was almost a full century later. And that is the general story of women's sports at the Olympic Games. They're provided opportunities way later than men are. Football at the Olympic Games in the 1910s and the 1920s was arguably the most popular sport at the Olympic Games. For example, when the Olympic Games were in Holland, in Amsterdam in 1928, more people went to the football matches than went to all the other matches, all the other competitions combined. The problem arose, though, when FIFA, which is the international federation that oversees football, they started to insist that their players be allowed to be paid. Most football players back then were working class, and because of the rules of amateurism in the Olympics, it was amateurs only until 1992. A lot of the best football players weren't allowed to go to the Olympic Games. So they urged the IOC to allow players to be paid, and the IOC said no. So FIFA said, well, tell you what, we're going to create our own tournament, our own Olympic football tournament. It's called the World Cup. The first one was in 1930. It is, arguably on par with the Olympics as one of these gargantuan sports festivals. I think the IOC really blew that one, although it's impossible to imagine, I think, the World Cup being part of the Olympic Games. Someone is asking about the story that says, what if the Olympic Games do not go, if they don't happen in Tokyo, that there are politicians in Florida who are saying they'd be willing to have the Olympics this summer. I don't actually know why those politicians are making that offer. I think that's just an absolutely impossible undertaking. You could not move the Olympic Games, even to a place like Florida. Geez, I don't think with a developed sports infrastructure, I just think it would be too big of an undertaking to move to a different place. I mean, Berlin or Los Angeles or spread throughout Florida. Particularly in this era of COVID. So I think if it doesn't happen in Tokyo in 2021, here's what's going to happen. There will be no Summer Olympics. And then Tokyo will probably jump to the head of the line for the 2030 Summer Games. Right now, the favorite seems to be Dusseldorf, actually. Dusseldorf is putting in an interesting bid where it's not just Dusseldorf, it's the whole region in Germany. And their argument is that they won't have to build any stadiums. Previously, the IOC really wanted all of the events to be in one city. They would really like the idea of it happening in one discrete place. But there are too many cities that want to bid for the Olympics and are just saying, look, we just don't want to build an equestrian center and a fencing center and a whitewater kayaking center. Just let us have the games and let us sort of farm out some of the games around us. So that's why Dusseldorf seems to be a pretty interesting bid. Another of the great questions is about why don't they just have the Olympics in the same place every 4 years? And that's a great question. The funny story, so the first modern Olympic Games were in 1896 in Athens. Coubertin, being French, wanted the first ones to be in Paris. But at that Congress that I told you about, a Greek, a member of the Greek family got so carried away by this in 1894. Coubertin was thinking Paris, 1900, this makes sense. He stood up and he said, we Greeks have always hosted the Olympic Games. We will host the games in 1896. And everyone stood up and started applauding. And so it was like Frankenstein's monster. You know, it was just already out of Coubertin's hands. And so the first games were in Greece in 1896. Coubertin was dedicated to the idea that they would be ambulatory, right? Meaning that they would move around from city to city. At the closing ceremony at the 1896 games, the king of Greece got up and he gave a speech and he said, these Olympic Games, we, the Greeks, they are our games. From now on, all Olympic Games will be in Greece. And Coubertin was standing right there. He's probably thinking to himself, there's no way they're going to be in Greece all the time. Coubertin worked behind the scenes to make sure that, again, the games would be ambulatory. They would move around. But because of the high costs now, again, you know, what happened in Sochi, what happened in Rio in 2016, building all these venues, all these stadiums, they've just fallen apart. They've never been used again. You know, a lot of them, they were going to be turned into schools and recreation centers, and they just don't even have the money in Rio to do this. There are those that say that what has to happen is that the games should be in one place. Los Angeles has raised their hand. We'll do it. Not all the people of Los Angeles, but the city government. One proposal that I find very interesting is that let's pick 4 sites. One in North America, one in South America, one in Europe, and one in Asia. I guess Africa gets left out of this, although Africa has not hosted an Olympics yet. And let's rotate among those sites. So different parts of the world get different, get the games every 16 or 20 years. That's one of the idea that's been proposed. I'm looking at the more questions here. I only got a couple more minutes. Thank you so much for staying with me. People have been asking about the television ratings faring over recent Olympics. Oh, they're outstanding. It's interesting. The Olympics, they revolve around the American television audience, and particularly the American television audience on the East Coast. That's where the big money is coming from, right? NBC is giving, hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, I think their last bid was close to $1 billion in order to televise the games. And NBC wants to show the games live, 8 p.m. New York City time. They don't always get to do it. But you may remember the Seoul Olympic Games, Seoul, South Korea in 1988. Most of the big time events actually happened at about 8 a.m. Seoul time, which was very discombobulating for the athletes, but it was done so people on the East Coast of the United States, they could watch their Olympic Games at 8 p.m. And of course, the way the networks use it, NBC uses this, they use it to sell their fall TV schedule. They put a lot of money into it. They get a lot of advertising money. The Olympics seem to work for NBC. So I'm sorry, there are some more great questions here. I really appreciate them. I think it's time for me to sign off. Again, I'm Matthew Andrews from UNC Chapel Hill. If you want to get online and find my email and send me a question, I love talking about this stuff. I'd be more than happy to respond to any of your questions. I don't think I'm going to get 500 questions now that I've said that, but feel free to reach out and contact me. Thank you so much to One Day University for having me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you in another lecture. Thank you so much.